Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's IFC Sustainability webinar entitled Behind the Boardroom Doors, Improving Board Functioning by Leveraging Behaviors and Personality Types. My name is Tigis Fantai. I'm a consultant with the Knowledge Management and Learning Team in IFC's Environment Social Governance Department, and I'll be moderating today's session. The IFC Sustainability webinar series is offered on a regular basis, and it provides an opportunity to share IFC's expertise and thought leadership on sustainability issues. We invite you to view past sessions on our website at www.ifc.org/sustainabilitywebinars. On our website, you can also sign up for our mailing list to stay informed on upcoming sessions as well as other sustainability learning events and knowledge products. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Sarah Kutari, who is the Corporate Governance Officer with IFC's Environment, Social and Governance Department, and Richard Westlake, who is the Corporate Governance Advisor, Independent Director, and IFC Nominee Director. A few ground rules for today's webinar. Our presenter will present for a bit, leaving plenty of time for questions and answers. You have all been muted upon entry to the webinar. Please use the chat function on the right side of your screen to send in your questions. Feel free to send questions throughout the event, not just during the question and answer portion. Please also send your questions to everyone, as there may be others with the same questions as you. Questions will be answered in the order received, but please understand that we may not be able to answer everyone due to time constraints. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and presentation will be posted on our website next week. After today's session, we will share an evaluation link. Please take 1 minute to provide us your feedback. This will be used to help us prepare a future session. We'll also send a final email once the recording and presentation have been posted to our website. And now I will turn the webinar over to Sarah and Richard.
Thank you very much, Tigis. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, according to the time zones where you're in. So my role during this webinar is merely an introductory one. I'm just here to introduce Richard, but I will also be taking your questions. So feel free, as Tigis said, at any point. You don't have to wait until the end. As whatever you see a point that deserves a comment or a question, please send me a message via chat. You can send it to me privately, and I'll make sure that Richard gets it and that he addresses it, time allowing for it. So Richard Westlake is joining us, is usually based in New Zealand, so we're lucky to have him in the closer time zone here in Manila. He comes regularly, as he sits on one of the banks of a large bank here, CBC, and he's been a board chairman and a board director for some 20 years now. So a lot of experience in New Zealand, but also around in Asia. He also has a lot of experience of working with board directors in the scope of Westlake governance, providing advice, board evaluations, and board training to boards. And he also is a trainer at the Institute of Directors in New Zealand. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining us. And you may start right now.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as Sarah says, I do come from New Zealand. I live in New Zealand. Most of you have probably never been there. It's the one country in the world that is not on the way to anywhere else. I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of boards over the last 15 or more years with my advisory business. What happens when you're a consultant and an advisor is that when things are working well, they don't need you, so I tend to see some of the bigger problems. I tend to see boards that aren't working well, and part of that has brought me to what we'll be talking about today. My own career, I haven't always been involved in corporate governance or in boards. I grew up in the United Kingdom, in England, and I started my career, in fact, as a pilot in the Royal Air Force. I then moved to New Zealand, where I became a banker and a merchant banker, and then I became a company director, so anybody who feels they can follow that career path, you're welcome. I've divided what we're going to talk about today into two particular parts. First of all, the first part of the session will be about how do we put a board together, because there's no way that there's no point in improving the board's functioning if you don't have the right board to start with. And then the second part of what I'll be talking about will be about how to make that board work well. How do we deal with some of the problems? How do we deal with some of the challenges? How do we use that very limited time that we have in the boardroom to get the very best decisions? Let's have a think to start with. What is governance? Let's just make sure we're all talking about the same thing. The word governance, we all use it. It comes from the ancient European languages of Latin and Greek. The word meaning navigator. The navigator, the person who sets the course, makes sure that we get to our destination, even though we probably have to work our way through some storms or find some obstacles on the way and solve some problems. But the thing about the navigator is that he or she is not the person doing the actual work, but making sure the work is being done. A more modern, accepted commercial corporate definition of corporate governance came when Sir Adrian Cadbury in Britain did a review of the British financial system in the 1990s, and he defined it as the system by which business organizations are both directed and controlled. Now, when you look at that, that looks very simple. There's a real wisdom in it, though, because what that little definition says, the system by which business organizations are directed and controlled, it picks up the tension, the constructive tension you always need to have in a boardroom. You have those who can see where the company needs to go, what it needs to be, what it needs to become, and how to get there. But if you have too many of those and they're not worrying about the control, you find yourself breaching all sorts of laws and regulations and potentially not having enough money to do what you want to do. On the other hand, you need those directors who we call controllers, those who can provide the control, the monitoring, the oversight, who can understand the risks. They're the people who make sure that we have the money, we have the resources, that we're acting within the law. If you have too many of those around a board table, they'll find every reason in the world why we shouldn't do something. So if you have too many of those, you'll do nothing. If you have too many who are keen to direct and get somewhere, you'll probably do too much. So a good board needs that tension between those who provide the direction and those who provide the control. Now, in reality, of course, that won't be two separate people, but there'll be different styles of people's behavior. And you have some people who are more naturally inclined to go on and get on with doing things, and you have those who are more inclined to provide the control and the oversight. But direction and control, being the navigator, setting the course. So that is what governance is about. So how do we go about building a board that in the end becomes a leading team? If we think about it, why do we have a board of directors in the first place? The real underlying purpose of a board is to help the chief executive do the job to the best of his or her ability. So what we need to use our time for in the boardroom is to make sure that we are making only those decisions that only the board of directors can make, which by the end of the meeting has given the chief executive the direction and the oversight and the control that they need. So to put the right people together, a methodology that we use I call BASELS. And I call it BASELS as an acronym. It's board appointments based on 4 components. Now, many of you will have appointed boards or seen board appointments or worked with boards where you see the skills and the experience they're looking for. The other 2 components are the networks or the personal linkages they have and their own personal style of operating. So the personal linkages, they're important because if you have a well-constructed board, you want to make sure that you have a board of directors who between them can engage with every one of our key stakeholder groups. It may be shareholders, it may be major customers, it may be regulators and government, it may be a range of owners, but you also need a range of personal styles. We have a saying in New Zealand, when I have a board of directors, if I have a board of directors of 9 people, I want to make sure that I have 9 directors. I don't want one director 9 times. So we need to get a range of skills, experience, personality styles, and those personal networks. Now, diversity has been a very big topic for many years now, but diversity has a lot of dimensions. First of all, let's think about the types of director we need around a board table. The managing director and potentially other directors who work in the business, we call those executive directors. They're the people who work day to day in the business, and then once a month or once every 3 months, they put on their director's hat and they walk into the boardroom. Then we have those people who don't work in the company during the day, but are not completely independent of it. So they may be major shareholders, they may be major suppliers, they may be major stakeholders or customers of another sort, or they may be former executives. So we call them non-executive directors, but not independent. And then we have the independent directors. Now, there is a growing school around the world which says that boards do or will benefit from having a number of independent directors. In fact, in some countries, there is a move that boards of publicly listed companies should typically have a majority of independent directors. The arguments for that are that those directors can act solely in the interest of the company and its shareholders with no other concerns, no other allegiances, and they can think differently, they can think independently. The argument against it is, of course, that an independent director can't know the business nearly as well as the executives who work inside the business. So generally, I think there is a view that the best boards, the most constructive boards, typically will have a mix of both executives and independent directors. But if you have too many executive directors, then it's likely to be dominated by the chief executive, because all the other executive directors, of course, will work for the chief executive, and so you may not have the willingness, the openness to challenge and test the chief executive's thinking or their strategy. Then how long should a director serve? Worldwide, there is a view that, particularly for independent directors, it's difficult to keep a genuine independence of thought for more than somewhere between about 8 and 10 years. In Singapore, for example, I think 9 years is now the limit for independent directors. Here in the Philippines, 9 years is the limit that they're imposing. You can no longer be deemed to be an independent director once you have served for more than 9 years. But I do think we need to make sure that we're not entirely focused just on absolute length of how long somebody's been on a board. On a complex board, if you join a board as a company director, you will probably find it takes you 2 or maybe even 3 years to really understand a complex business. So for a director who serves perhaps only 5 or 6 years, are they really able to give their best to that business? Are they really able to contribute as much as possible? So we need to balance the experience of those who understand the business, those who've been there for a while, those who understand what makes the company unique, and fresh ideas, fresh thinking, and the people who can challenge the existing strategy, especially when you look at the digital revolution, how it's putting so many businesses effectively, making them extinct with just one complete change in the paradigm in which a business is operating. So director type is the first sort of diversity. Secondly, the backgrounds. We want to have that range of skills, experience, linkages, and styles that I talked about. Think also about the professional backgrounds. Worldwide, I think we see far too many boards of directors which are heavily loaded with lawyers and accountants who traditionally form the backbone of so many boards. What about the engineers? What about the salespeople? What about the production engineers? So we need to think about what are the other professional skills that we need around a board table. You need people who can actually understand what makes the business tick. And thirdly, we do really need to make sure we have a range of that diversity of perspectives. That's what we're looking for in diversity, the diversity of perspective, the ability to see a problem from a different angle, the ability to ask questions that no one else in the room has thought about. And when you look at so many companies, many of the companies you work with, I'm sure, will be family-owned, will be privately owned by one or maybe two shareholders. How diverse is the thinking around that board table? If you have all your board members from the same family, it becomes very, very difficult. If you have all your board members coming from working within the one company, it's extremely difficult because so much of the thinking is likely to be led by what the managing director or the chief executive is thinking. So those are challenges that you face, and they can also be challenges for a new independent director coming in because they have to be able to provide an independent voice, but without fear of isolating themselves or of offending and making the board dysfunctional. Then let us have a quick look at the other realm of diversity that we're talking about, perhaps the more traditional one, the demographic diversity. Gender, of course, is the most obvious sense here. Globally, we have, for example, in many countries what they refer to as the 30% movement, where there is a drive to make sure that by 2020, at least 30% of board members of major companies are composed of women. There is more and more evidence, which I'm sure many of you will have seen, to show the benefit of gender diversity in terms of board performance. Globally, statistically, companies which have 2 or more women among this number around the board of directors will perform, on average, 3 to 4% per annum better in terms of shareholder return than boards which are composed solely of men. Now, the question you ask is which is cause and which is effect? Do they perform well because they have women, or do they have women because they're high-performing boards? Now, that's a question that I don't think we can answer. There isn't enough evidence, but the correlation is unquestioned, and there's a lot of analysis around that. But perhaps one of the other areas of demographic diversity that we don't talk about enough is age diversity. I can almost assure you that if you have a board which has 4 males in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 4 females in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, you probably have less diversity than if you have one person of 29 years old sitting on the same board. Age diversity gives you the generational diversity. It gives you the difference in perspective that your millennials or your earlier, your Gen Ys or whoever, whichever generation might bring. I've been lucky enough to serve on boards with people of all ages, and I can honestly remember the one board that I chaired about 10 years ago. A 28-year-old was appointed to this board where almost everybody else was in their 50s and 60s, and the different perspective he brought gave us some wonderfully useful, some wonderfully helpful insights into how our customers worked, and also some very, very sophisticated thinking about some of the risks that we were facing as a business overall. Then we want to perhaps think about the other types of demographic diversity, the ethnicity and geography. Where do people come from? Are they from the same cultures? Are they from differing cultures? And this becomes particularly important with companies, organizations that are looking beyond borders or looking to appeal to more than just a single cultural or geographic set. But in the end, whenever we are making an appointment, the question we must ask ourselves is, who is the best person for this role? Now, the best person will depend on all of those questions, the type of director, the background, the perspective they bring, and some of the demographics as well. It means we must remain open-minded, but at the same time, we must make sure that we never move away from who is the best person for this role, because the moment we move away from that as being the test, we start to compromise, we start to dilute the overall quality of the board.
Richard, as you move on to the part about personality style, I'll just stop you here because we've got a few comments and questions about achieving board diversity in the first place. So it's related mainly to family-owned firms, which some people both in the public forum and privately have raised in most of these countries. So we have, for example, Yemen and Hong Kong, where it's 70%, 90%. Convincing people to adding an independent director is the first challenge. And I have another comment also from Anya saying, in addition to that, having young people into the board is a challenge, given that how could all elder members take them seriously? And funnily enough, Richard and I were discussing this over dinner, particularly in the context of some cultures where age is extremely important and you have to be differential to your elders. How would you address this, Richard?
Sarah, thank you. And to the people who asked those questions, they're very, very real questions, and I won't pretend they're easy to deal with. Nor will I necessarily try to claim that I have the answer for every culture either. First of all, how do we convince family hierarchies, family patriarchs, family matriarchs to allow an independent board member into the boardroom? This is probably the single biggest challenge that family companies face. The answer I typically try to give, and it doesn't really always help, is try it. Try it yourself, but this depends on having the right person. I've seen so many cases where people have gone out and they have appointed someone who is a trusted family advisor, but a family advisor who's not prepared to bring an independent view, a family advisor who simply adopts the view that the board chairman, the family patriarch or matriarch takes. And if all they're doing is echoing what the board chairman is saying, it's probably a complete waste of time. Similarly, somebody who completely upsets the functioning of the board is going to be just as useless. So you do need somebody who is trusted by the family. You do need somebody who has an independent mind, but they have to be of the right personality, style, and fit, which we're going to be talking about now. The right style and fit to fit with the culture, the behavior, and the values that the board and the family have. I've been lucky enough to work with some family company boards, those that have gone through exactly this challenge. I've seen one particular case where it was, I would have to say, a complete failure with the board member they appointed, because it was somebody who simply did not share the same values and goals for the company that the rest of the family did. On the other hand, I've seen one board just a few years ago where I was doing quite a lot of work, a large family grouping which was in the third or fourth generation, so they were getting past the real danger phase. They were in about the third or fourth generation of family ownership and leadership, and it just made a massive difference because for once when they brought an independent director in, it was somebody who was able to ask questions that nobody else had dared to, because it went against the family's values to ask questions or to challenge. Which really leads into the second question about how can you realistically bring a young person in those cultures where age counts for everything. Again, it's a very difficult thing to do, and I think if we're honest, even in sort of if you like, some of the more developed Western economies, this is still a very, very, well, it's delicate, and it's a relatively new phenomenon as well. But with the changes that we're seeing in industry worldwide, I think the wiser companies, the companies that are more far-sighted, are saying we actually need to get the perspective of the people who are from a different generation from ours. Business changes so fast today that how can those of us even of my generation approaching middle age, how can people even of my generation honestly understand the perspective of the workforce that is in its 20s and 30s? for example, I have 4 children. They're all adult children. There's 8 years between them. So the youngest is 8 years younger than the oldest, and even she is a different generation from my oldest daughter. So how can I, who am a parent to those 4 children, really try understand what they're thinking and what their perspective is? Again, how does that young person get their voice heard without being objectionable? How does the older person hold themselves to actually listen and respect the voice of the younger person? These are all difficult things, and I suspect they're all different in every culture. But what I would say is that the more I see of that diversity, that age diversity, the more I see the value in it. Does that help? I hope that answers the question, Sarah. Which leads us on really quite naturally to this slide you have in front of you. This comes from a book by a Professor Richard LeBlanc, a Canadian, who has studied boardroom dynamics and boardroom effectiveness for many, many years all around the world, not just in the Western world, but all around the globe, large and small companies. And the way he describes boards is they need to have this mixture of personal styles, which are based on the 2 axes. First of all, those who tend to agree against those who tend to disagree, consensus against dissent. So is the first reaction to say yes and, or is your first instinct to say yes but? In other words, to disagree with something. And the other axis is those who typically will start a question or a statement with we, the collective, and those who will typically start it with I, the individual. So I think this, or we could do this. How could we do this better? And the green headings that you can read, I hope they are obvious in what they mean, but the green ones are the constructive, the positive aspect of each of those personality styles. So for example, the change agent, the left-hand corner, the tendency to want to disagree with the current strategy, to challenge the current strategy, to change something, but the collective, we together. So the sort of question that person is likely to ask is, how could we do this better? How could we find a better way of doing this? The negative aspect of that personality style we refer to as the controller. So instead of asking a constructive question like, how could we do this better? It'll be, here's what you should do. It'll be the person who tries to take command. Somebody who thinks that by being a board member, or worse still, think as the board chair, that they're also the boss of the board. Then you have the challengers and the critics. The challenger will ask a question such as, why do we think this is still the best way of doing this? Why do we think this is still the best strategy? The critic, on the other hand, will say, that won't work, and that simply kills the debate and the discussion. The counselor over on the right. Typically, we see counselors were usually people who've got a bit of experience, sometimes a few grey hairs, they may be middle-aged or beyond. It'll be the person who's seen a bit of things happening. So the sort of person who'll say, look, I think we can see a way through this problem. How do you think we should handle it? The cheerleader, on the other hand, the negative side of that, will be saying statements such as, oh, I think management's doing a wonderful job, and by the way, lunch was fabulous. So typically adds very little, very nice people usually, but adds nothing, whereas the counselor will be positive, trying to lead to a solution. And the fourth personality style, the consensus builder, is the person who's saying, let's just find out now, what points do we agree on? Whereas the conformist, the negative style, will be, I think we all agree on everything, don't we? None of us disagrees. I agree with everything the last person's just said. The person who flips and flops between whoever spoke last. And then the person who has to make all of this work is the board chair. This role is absolutely crucial to having an effective board. You want to make sure you have a board chair who is acting more like the conductor of an orchestra, someone who can make sure that everyone is playing their tune, make sure that everyone's performing on the day, and can't afford to miss a beat, has to be watching what's going on, has to be guiding it, has to be getting us through the performance in the time we're allowed, as opposed to the caretaker who's simply sitting there and sees him or herself as simply a facilitator. So we don't have time to talk about it tonight, or today, but if you have too many of any one of those personality styles, you will end up, again, achieving almost nothing. For example, if you have too many change agents, you'll never get to a decision. If you have too many consensus builders, you'll never have a debate or a decision, and so on round the room. So we have the different personality styles, and a good board will have people with each of those personal styles there, and a good board member will be able to observe which of those is missing around a debate. So, for example, if you have a board of people who are all very, very polite to each other, as some cultures have, as some companies have, they may all be consensus builders and counselors. A smart director will be able to understand that actually what we need right now is a change agent or a challenger, and will find themselves able to move into one of those quadrants. Most of us will have a natural quadrant that we fit in most comfortably, but a smart, experienced director who also understands how his or her colleagues are behaving and feeling will be able to move between those four. So now that's putting a board together. How do we now make it all work? The first thing is boardrooms are debating chambers. We do need to have disagreement. We do need to have differing perspectives. If we haven't got differing perspectives, what's the point of having a range of people in the room examining an issue? So first of all, what we have to remember is we need the differing perspectives, but at the end we want to get to a consensus decision, a collective decision, which in itself is a little bit of a paradox. So as a board chairman, I work really hard to try and get to a point where all my board can agree with us together. The reason for this is that actually we're individuals, but we're all collectively responsible for the decisions we take. If it all goes terribly, terribly wrong and the company goes broke, people don't ask usually, what did you think, Richard? What did you think, Sarah? What they ask is, what do the minutes show that the board decided to do? So if I'm a board member, I'm part of that decision. So what we have to do is accept that once a decision is made, it is the board's decision. If you really can't agree, you've got three options. First thing you can do, persuade the other people around to your own point of view. Sometimes you can have a new perspective, or you've got some different information you can use. Hey, can we look at this problem from a different angle? And I'm sure we've all been in meetings where somebody's spoken last and suddenly changed our entire perspective. Secondly, say, I don't agree with this, and then get over it, and if the rest of the board wants to do something, go along with it. Most of the decisions are not so important that we can't live with them. Just last week, I was in a board meeting of a company where they decided to do something which I've argued very strongly against doing, but it's not a fundamental question of the law, it's not a fundamental question around strategy or even around ethics. I just don't agree that we've done the right thing, but in the end I said, look, I'm going to vote against this particular point, but if that's what the rest of the board wants to do, I won't get in the way of it. And from now on, the decision's been taken, I'll be supporting that decision. But the third point, the third option you have, if you really can't get over it, for whatever reason, if it's an ethical issue, if you feel it's illegal, if you feel it's just downright wrong, if you simply can't accept the board's decision and you're a director, you can't be a director anymore. You have to have the integrity, the personal integrity to say, I cannot live with that decision, I'm leaving the board. It is not acceptable, once the board has made a decision, it is not acceptable to try to undermine or keep raising it or to try and reverse that decision time after time. Once a board has made a decision, right or wrong, as a director, I have an obligation to get in and support it unless some fundamentally new information comes to light. So then we have some wonderful characters that we find ourselves having to deal with. First of all, the difficult ones. Now, let's be absolutely clear. This is not the same thing as directors who ask difficult questions. The point is, dissent, disagreeing, is not the same as disloyalty. Sometimes the best directors are the people who disagree strongly. So asking good questions is an absolute key to being an effective board member. So dealing with difficult board members, though, if you have directors who dominate discussion or are digressing from the issue all the time, not sticking to the agenda, do they have a problem? Are they aggressive personalities who are bullying people? And if they are, then if the rest of the board doesn't deal with it, the board chair needs to. Please understand one of the absolute fundamentals of governance. If you do not have an effective chair, you will not have an effective board. If you have a problem with your board chair, you either have to fix it or you have to fix the board by replacing the chair. And if you can't do either of those two things, I'd question very carefully whether you want to remain on that board, because I can promise you if you do not have an effective board chair, you will not have a working, effective board. The third point is the director, the quiet ones, the ones who simply don't contribute. Is it because they're not prepared for the meeting? Well, we need to deal with that because they have an obligation, they have a responsibility to do so. Are they not capable of contributing, or are they simply quiet personalities? And one of the skills of a board chair, again, is to, as I was advised many years ago, watch the quiet ones. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who have the most valuable question of the day. Sometimes personalities will be different. So it's often best to approach it outside the boardroom. I noticed you weren't participating today, Richard. Was there a reason for it? Was there something that you weren't able to have your view on, or was it that you felt uncomfortable about it because somebody was behaving in a way that made you feel uncomfortable? So you must get to the bottom of this, because if you've got 8 or 9 or 10 people in your boardroom, you want to make sure that all of them have the ability to contribute. The really difficult board members, this gets more challenging again for the board chair. First of all, remember, dissent is not disloyalty, but if you have a director who's breaching those fundamental duties of care and loyalty to the company, those who are constantly promoting their own interests or the interests of their nominating shareholder or somebody who's acting against the interests of the business, you need to deal with it fast. Similarly, anybody who is breaching, who is breaking those fundamental rules of principles of governance, boardroom confidentiality, one of them, if you don't deal with it, your board is going to be dysfunctional very, very quickly indeed, because the moment you start breaching boardroom confidentiality, the moment what goes said in the boardroom moves outside the boardroom and gets told to other shareholders, then all of a sudden you kill the debate in the boardroom because people are no longer willing to speak openly and confidently around the board table. So, where were we? We want to build a board to be a champion team, not just a team of champions. It's not enough just simply to get 8 or 10 of the best high-powered, high-qualified individuals. They have to be able to work together. You need 4 C's, just like any successful team. You need to have the right people in the room who have the right skills, the right range of skills. Most importantly, like any team or any crew, there's no point in having the right skills if they don't exercise them, if they don't perform on the day. So board meetings, they're challenging, they're testing times. There's no such thing as a routine board meeting. Every board meeting should always be thinking, how are we helping the chief executive do her or his job better? What are the decisions that we need to take that only we can take? And by the time we get to the end of the meeting, the question we ask ourselves is, we've been sitting here for however many hours it is the company better off now than when we walked in this morning? Because at the end of a board meeting, if you can't honestly put your hand on your heart and say, yes, the company's better off now than it was when we walked in, you ask why we wasted all this money and time and preparation coming together if we haven't made the company move further. And the final C, the final component, is you will not have, as I said, an effective board if you haven't got an effective board chair.
Richard, several questions I have coming in right now regard the fact that, all right, we are aware that there are different personalities, But once we become aware that you have these different personalities of a board, what can you do to make that board more functioning and more effective?
I think the first thing...
Sorry, just to add, is saying, oh, is it an awareness, is it a training, is it putting an advisor on some of the board meetings to assess the performance?
Very, very good perceptive question again. Coming down to the difference in personalities, there's a difference between personalities and a difference in values. One thing that is absolutely vital is that everybody sitting around that board can work together, that they can share the same set of values, and that they can share the same goals for the organization. You do need to have those aligned to start with. Having got that, though, I think the range of personality styles is important as long as it's not one personality at the expense of another. So, for example, bullying in a boardroom to me is totally unacceptable. Dominating by any, perhaps usually the older, the larger, physically larger, the more experienced male members of the board, those types of behavior are actually very destructive because they stop other people from participating. Again, what I've just been saying for the last 10 minutes, it comes down to largely the quality of the chair, to be able to manage that, to be able to win the respect of their colleagues around the board table so that you actually can decide. Part of the role of the chair, part of the thing the chair has to do is to decide who needs to speak, who's going to speak, and who needs not to speak next, to be able to give everybody a fair view and to allow those people to have the confidence that they will be listened to, that they will be able to get their voice across.
Thank you, Richard. And before, again, you move on to the final part of the presentation, a clarification that we have, I think it's a technical point really, but it's good that we clarified that. So I'll read you the question as it is. What is the problem with a dissenting opinion and leaving it as a record that a director did not agree with it? That doesn't mean undermining the board, just a record of a different view or opinion.
I'll answer you very simply. There is nothing wrong with a dissenting opinion in the end. If in the end I think that the board should do X and the rest of the board thinks we should do Y, I can vote against it and have that on the record. The problem comes because in the end we will all be accountable for the decision that the board took, and the question I have to ask myself, if I vote against it, can I still live with it? Can I still comfortably be a member of this board that's doing something that I didn't agree with, because I'm actually still accountable for that. I may be held to account for that decision. I had a case a few years ago where I was chair of a board which made a decision. One of the board members argued very strongly against it and ended up voting against it. In the end, she succeeded me as the board chair, and the decision turned out to be actually not a very good decision, and she, who had voted against it, ended up for the next 3 years having to defend the decision the board had taken. And to her credit, I never once heard her say, but you must remember I voted against this. So it is real life. It's not easy. It does happen. But no, there is nothing wrong in voting against something. I'd much rather somebody spoke the truth and put their own real life perspective into it.
Thank you, Rich.
Pleasure. All right. So we want to not just build a board. We want to have a board not just that lasts for today. We want to build for the future. We need to make sure that we build in a culture and a process and actually a budget for developing governance skills and training, for making sure that people understand their role, that they understand how to make their board meetings effective. There are many, many training programs, there are many, many coaching sessions, there are many ways, and again it comes down to the right people with the right skills, experience and personality styles in the room who know how to get the best from the whole team sitting in the boardroom. If we want to set the tone from the top, if we want to set a culture of continuous improvement, we should start at the top. Increasingly worldwide, we're seeing more and more boards evaluating or having themselves evaluated, their performance evaluated, their effectiveness evaluated. Less important is I think the evaluation of individual directors. Let me start again. it's less important to evaluate the individual directors than it is to evaluate the whole board, because in the end, how well is the team performing, how well is the board as a whole performing, is the crucial question. But regular board and director evaluations, not necessarily every year, but perhaps every 2 years or maybe on a cycle, where we'll review the board 1 year and the individual directors and the chair the other year. But some process like that to set the tone from the top to ensure that we are continually trying to improve our own processes. And thirdly, what are we going to need in terms of that board composition and mix? What worked in 2010 probably needs to be amended again in 2015, probably will need to be amended and changed again in 2020. So no director should think that they're there for life. But if I can leave you with one final note for all board members everywhere, from Jan du Plessis, who was the chairman of one of the biggest mining companies in the world, Rio Tinto, you should never have a situation on a board where directors are afraid to ask a stupid question. And if I could add to that, no, you should never have a situation where directors are afraid to ask a stupid question. Because the point I would add to that is, if you have read your board papers and if you understand the business, the only stupid question is the one that you leave the board meeting wishing that you had asked. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I would be delighted to answer any further questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. As you were talking, we did indeed have more questions coming in. And so some of them related back to the part about the board composition and the balance board. Maybe we can take a couple of these really quickly so that we can focus on the personality. So one question was, what about the turnover of directors? Is it appropriate to replace directors regularly on a kind of rotation basis or staggered basis, as we say?
Look,
and also another question related to that, also from the same person, is about the board side. Is there any guideline for the total number of directors to make a board effective?
Oh, look, asking some excellent questions. First of all, let's start with the board size. There is quite a lot of analysis, academic analysis, which says that the best sized group for making complex decisions is somewhere in the high single figures, so somewhere between 6 and 9. And I deliberately keep it relatively broad within there. If you have fewer than about 5 people, if you have a board of only 3 or 4 people, it's really difficult to get genuine diversity of perspective, genuine debate, because in the end, a small group like that would pretty much end up knowing what everybody else is thinking. If you have it too much bigger than, let's say, 12 or 13, it's almost impossible for everybody to participate. And what tends to happen, if you have a board that's too large, what happens is a small group of the chairman's closest colleagues will typically come together and form maybe only an informal executive committee of the board, which will make the real decisions. Then everybody else will turn up, but find that all of a sudden they don't have the same amount of information and they don't really feel they're part of the decisions. It's not always as simple as that, because, for example, some companies, highly complex companies, or companies that have a very broad range of stakeholders, and certainly global NGOs, organizations like that, you might well say that because of the diversity of issues, the diversity of stakeholder interests, even the diversity of things we're trying to achieve, you may need a slightly larger board. So then you're possibly looking at the 10 to 12, maybe 14. I know some countries typically operate with even larger boards than that. But again, do they really, or do they have a larger number of people sitting around the board table and still only perhaps 4 or 5 or 6 people really contributing to the decision making? So that would be the board size. As for rotation, it's a very interesting question. There are 2 sides to it. First of all, as I talked about, people who are there too long, will they be able to genuinely bring the best perspective, the right perspective, a fresh perspective? On the other hand, if you only have a board of, say, 5, 6, or 7 people, I'm sure you've experienced the difference it makes when you change a director. So the board dynamics inevitably change. When the board chairman changes, then the chief executive's life is going to change as well. for one reason or another, and I think most chief executives underestimate that. In terms of rotation, I try to make sure that it doesn't all happen at once, because you do want to retain that continuity, that, if you like, the chief executive needs the continuity as well. If you have a chief executive who's performing well, they need continuity of guidance, oversight, and of a board that actually understands what's going on. One of the biggest problems with boards that replace themselves too fast is they really don't understand the business. And what happens then? Either they start making decisions which are badly informed, or worse still, the chief executive realizes they don't understand and just takes over and effectively dominates.
Thank you. Now we have another question about what a board can do for continuous improvement. Is this about skill or knowledge training or team building? So I'm going to ask you first, Richard, if you could answer that question with a specific lens of the personality question. How do you fix any dysfunctional board? And then maybe you can address the larger training needs of a board.
All right, thank you. First, let me just repeat what I've said several times today so far, which is if you don't have an effective board chair, there's no point in trying to fix the rest of the board. If you haven't got an effective chair, you really need to fix that first. If you have an effective chair, so much of this depends on the caliber, the leadership, and all those things. Skills development, team building, and actually getting to know each other. One of the things that I think we so often fail to do with boards is get to know each other as individuals. I have put a huge value on getting to know my board colleagues as people, not just as board members. So rather than us all turning up at 9 in the morning, having a board meeting starting at 9 o'clock in the morning, finishing at lunchtime, and all going home, I like a board to turn up the night before. Let's have some dinner together. Let's share some time together, some informal time. Let's find out what it is that the person I'm always disagreeing with, what drives them? Why are they on the board? Do they share the same goals as I do? There's one board I sit on, and have done now for 7 years, where 2 of the other board members and I always seem to disagree with each other. So they're the ones I choose to sit with at dinner. I remember one of my old university professors said to me years and years ago, Richard, when did you last learn something from somebody who agreed with you? And I think there's a lot of truth in that. When did you last learn something from people who agreed with you? All they're going to do is just make you feel good. The people you learn from are the people who have a different opinion. So think about how we do that, but having different opinions is not the same as having a dysfunctional board. I want different opinions, but in the end, we want to get to the same decisions. We want to get to that collective decision, and therein lies the challenge. It takes goodwill. It does take good training in how do we work together as a team, not just as an individual executive. That's a big career transition from going from being a business executive where you're talking about I to working in a boardroom where everything we do as we. It's a massive psychological change.
Thank you, Richard. Related question, and we still have 6 more minutes before we have to conclude. In practice, so if something can't be fixed in practice, if you determine a director is not a right fit for your board, as the chairman, I would assume,
yep.
How do you ask him or her to resign or leave? Who should do it?
Yeah, I think in most cases it has to come back to the board chair to do that. One way you can do it, one way that I have seen it work effectively is doing individual director evaluations where each director anonymously evaluates their colleagues. Now, if I have a board of 8 people and all 7 of them write in their feedback, Richard really should consider whether he wants to remain on this board because he's not adding any value, I think I'd probably start to get the message and I might decide to resign. If that still doesn't happen, as the board chair, I'm the person who has to deal with it. I have to sit down, and there's a number of ways to do it. I do want to avoid it becoming personal. Usually it's not a personal matter. It may be that somebody's been there too long, that they no longer have the skills the company needed when they came onto the board. In a way, it's the same with a chief executive. You may have a person who was absolutely superb for the last 5 years, but clearly is the wrong person for the next 5 years. So as a board chair, I'll talk through the person's aspirations. I'll talk through the skills and the experience, the style that I believe the company needs. I'll typically try to coach them so that they get to the decision that they perhaps have outlived their time there. If it's somebody who still won't get the message, wants to stay, what I have done in the past is to say, look, when your term comes up, assuming that people are on a fixed term of appointment, reviewable perhaps every 3 or every 4 years, if as a board chairman I say I won't be supporting your reappointment to the board, then it's normally very difficult for somebody to try and stay then, and if they do, it will probably be a boardroom coup and you'll find the chairman gets replaced. If it's somebody, though, who has a controlling shareholding interest and they have the ability to put themselves there, then it becomes very difficult indeed. We only have to look at what has been happening with Uber, the ride-sharing company over the last few months, where the major shareholder, the founder, has first of all been sacked as chief executive and then is rumoured in the background to have been trying to manoeuvre his way back into the position, and who is still, I understand, on the board of directors, which must make for a very, very interesting dynamic in there as they appoint their new chief executive.
Thank you, Richard. We have 4 more minutes, so I will ask you one last question and then kind of try to take 2 minutes to summarize the comments that have been coming on. We've had a few questions here and in the survey as well about the role of board members on the sustainability agenda. For most of the boards, it's been pointed out that this is a new space to work on environment, social, as well as governance issues. How do personality impact the ability of directors that have been there for some time, looking at numbers, looking at the bottom line, looking at the performance, to embrace the sustainability agenda?
Look, I think even older directors, more conservative directors now, understand that if you want to have sustainability of the company, if you want to have a sustainability of a business, then you have to consider more than profit. You also have to consider the planet. You also have to consider people. So the triple bottom line type of reporting, maybe cultural as well in some cultures, but typically the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet, these are now becoming mainstream. I'm not so sure that they're even new anymore. Certainly I've noticed within the last, it's probably been over the last 8 to 10 years in most of the boards I've been involved with, but certainly in the last 5, they have moved from being new issues and sometimes quite uncomfortable issues to being absolutely core mainstream issues. And I go back to the question, what is best for the company? Duty of loyalty to the company, duty of care for the company, duty to act in the company's best interest. Well, the company's best interest, that it continues to be able to attract capital, that it continues to be able to attract employees, that it continues to be able to attract shareholders and people who are prepared to deal with us, and therefore we cannot ignore all of those other cultural, ethical, social, environmental issues as well, and they have to be a part of what we are. And sadly, we do see companies such as Uber, which try to ignore it. They think they're isolated from it, and you see the problems they get themselves into.
Thank you very much, Richard. We've just about 1 minute, so very quick summary on my side. You started off by refreshing our principles on what is governance and what is a balanced board, and you moved on to explaining the different personality types using the LeBlanc model, but also sharing in your particular advice and your particular experience. Thanks very much for that. There has been a few comments in addition to the questions I raised, and I'm sorry if I didn't have the time to take all of your questions. Some comments have been made on the role of training programs for board members, and yes, this is something that IFC works in a lot in many different countries, including Yemen, since the comment is coming from Yemen, in terms of building the capacity of Institute of Directors in that field, and other players as well. And Richard himself, as I mentioned, intervenes at the IOD New Zealand, and also and IFC, of course, yes. And there's also been a good point made between the links between the board functioning and good governance and how ultimately it all ties back. If you're training the board members, it affects good corporate governance, but it also helps them improve personality styles and personality management. Thank you very much for joining us today. And as Tigis reminded us and sent you by chat, there is a link. If you could take a few minutes to fill in the evaluation, we'd be immensely grateful. And we'll also share back to you the link for the recording if you want to share it with people from your network. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure working with you.